ICCM presents Community Music as a Critical Practice, exploring positionality and critical reflection in community music inquiry.
So, my name is Jo, and I'm a community musician from London, England. I know a lot of you on the call, but I thought it was quite important to introduce myself. Much of my practice includes songwriting with groups, and after several years of professional practice, working under the titles of workshop leader, supporting musician, and mentor for participatory music making projects, I decided to embark on PhD research, which I undertook at the ICCM. I was curious to better understand what I was doing and why, and whether I was doing the right thing. And I talk about notions of right in my PhD, right being contingent and dependent on many things. I currently work with the ICCM as an associate and with some other organisations, and I continue to make music with schools and children in my local area. I'd like to begin today by thanking the ICCM for the invitation to contribute to this Criticality in Community Music series and to consider positionality and critical reflection in community music inquiry with you today. Through the talk and the conversations that follow, I'd like to open up dialogue around the choices that we make as practitioners and researchers, and the motivations, assumptions, values, and beliefs that may underpin those choices, and finally, the political implications that those choices may have. I'm going to begin today's discussion with positionality before moving on to explore critical reflection in community music inquiry, drawing on examples from my PhD. And I'll end with a discussion of community music as a critical practice, which I suggest on a micro level as an approach to community music practice, and on a macro level as a reinstating of the political imperatives of community music. So, the significance of positionality, I've just realised I haven't set my timer, Rory. There we go. The significance of positionality has come up across the Criticality in Community Music series. For example, presenting on racial justice and music, the Gahu project team discussed the significance of self-location, both ancestral and political, alongside acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of, for example, the land to anchor their work in the colonial history and the struggle for racial and anti-colonial justice in the context in which they practice. You'll see the link to this talk coming up in the chat. And for those of you watching this presentation as a recording on YouTube, please go to the links underneath the video for all of the things I referenced today. In his talk on diversifying methodologies in community music contexts, historical trauma as a critical ally, Teoti Rakena used the question, "What team do I play for?" by way of self-location. And he expressly articulated that he speaks from his position as an Indigenous academic. By offering the questions, where do we come from? Who are we, and where are we going, as a starting point for his discussion of the need for robust critique of arts and health research with reference to music and health, Stephen Clift also touches upon positionality. Later in the presentation, Stephen explains that we can judge research from different philosophical perspectives to question the assumptions on which it rests. And I consider his problematizing of the failure to recognize things such as the role of individual agency in research and the centrality of language in our social constructions of reality to contribute to the rationale for reflecting on one's positionality as a practitioner and/or researcher. This is because it supports recognition that as researchers and practitioners, we are imbricated in the practice and inquiry. We're not distant or neutral observers, which is something I'll go on to discuss later in this talk. And finally, Kim Buskoff draws on Diana Yerechuk to problematize the normalizing of community in community music as always already inclusive, and thereby as an always and only good thing. I suggest this could be extrapolated to the community musician's intentions for practice, whereby identifying good intentions can lead to an assumption that good outcomes will follow. Before I go on to consider some of the points raised through the series, I'm now going to take a moment to talk a little about what positionality is and to talk about my positionality. So, broadly speaking, positionality refers to what we know and believe, how who you are and what makes you who you are, such as your experiences, backgrounds, and preferences, and so forth, shapes the way you make sense of the world. In research, for example, positionality refers to the stance or positioning of the researcher in relation to the social and political context of the study. In community music practice, I suggest it refers to the positioning of the community musician in relation to the context of their practice. And I suggest that acknowledging positionality is important, to acknowledge that we do have different social identities, which the Gahu project team and Tioti Wakena have highlighted, and that from this we have different access to privilege and power. So here I'd like to draw attention to some perspectives on positionality from community musicians. Talking about community music inquiry through action research, Alicia de Banfi Hall, I don't know if she's on the call, but if you are, Alicia, hello, suggests that it's paramount to reflect openly on your role and positionality as a researcher, since in action research, the researcher is seen as part of the research process, and their ability to actively influence the process through the research is acknowledged. Alicia explains that this challenges traditional notions of the role of the researcher as an objective outsider. And she talks about a model for positionality which has 6 different points on it, considering insider and outsider status. And interestingly, Alicia highlights that as a researcher, you can have multiple positionalities. Again, a link going to her research video is in the chat. Here I'm just going to take a minute to talk about my very crude line drawing person. Now, I can't decide if this person has arms or if their arms are down by their sides and you can't see them, but I offer this very crude drawing as a way to talk about what is seen, heard, and experienced is seen, heard, and experienced by someone. Knowledge and understanding generated from the seeing, experiencing, and listening is bound up with the person seeing, experiencing, and listening. Phenomenologist Don Ida has some much better drawings and kind of visual experiments that you can explore thinking about this in his book, Experimental Phenomenology, which I would encourage you to go to. And in this realm, we're really thinking about intentionality in phenomenological terms. Now, I think the musician's knowing is an exemplar of this. So what musicians know and how they come to know can be deeply personal. It's embodied whilst at the same time being constituted in relation, as their embodied knowing is developed through the musical and social interaction with others in a given context. So think of refining your musicianship in the context of a group rehearsal, for example. It's your learning constituted in relation in the context with others. I find Donna Haraway's God trick helpful here, and I've touched on that before. Donna Haraway is a professor in the departments of the history of consciousness and feminist studies, and in challenge to the belief that hard data and unquestionable fact exist somewhere out there to be found by neutral observers, with the God trick, Haraway asserts that there's no view from nowhere. Knowledge comes from a knower, and subsequently power dynamics must be recognised in inquiry, and those undertaking the inquiry need to be attentive to the context of discovery not only the context of justification. If we acknowledge that there is no view from nowhere, that knowledge comes from a knower, acknowledging the stance or positioning of the researcher in relation to the socio and political context of the study feels all the more important. Now, I consider community musician Kathleen Turner's discussion of positionality to be a nod to the need to be attentive to the context of motivations for community music practice and not just the context of their intended outcomes. In a video produced for Community Music Learning, Kathleen shares this insight to her practice in discussion of arts practice research, exploring the identity of the community musician through song and story. Kathleen describes in this video how she was motivated to be a community musician, and that she knew that she was committed to equality of access to the arts, to inclusion, to agency, to social justice, to creative impact, but that she hadn't stopped to consider where that came from, where the values that informed her work originated, what beliefs, privileges, assumptions she carried into the community space, and how those impacted how she saw the room, how she perceived the people she worked with, and how she understood the value or spirit of what was being made together. I think Kathleen really beautifully highlights the importance of acknowledging positionality through her work. Again, how we, what we know and believe, how who you are and what makes you who you are shapes the way you make sense of the world, shapes the way you undertake your practice, and can shape the meaning making or the meaning that is made through and from that practice. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about my positionality. It feels rather odd to talk about positionality and not offer my own. So this is a picture of a market, which is a few streets down, a little bit down the road from where I was born in London and where I continue to live and practice. As I reflect on the experiences that led to or informed my practice as a community musician, I am drawn to the place where I grew up and developed my practice. Living in London's East End, a densely populated inner city area, I often reflected on the proximity of my neighbours. Whilst physically close, in other ways we were separated. Home to British, Bangladeshi and white working class communities, attempts at division through scapegoating the other, Islamophobia and racism persist. As a child, I've got a really vivid memory of hearing from outside my window the racist chants being shouted from an open-top double-decker bus that was being used by the British National Party at the time to campaign for their votes. And they had somebody with a megaphone shouting obscene things, and I think I was around 9 at the time, and I ran out onto the balcony. We live on the 13th floor of a high-rise tower block. My mum still lives there now. And I remember my mum grabbing me and pulling me back inside, telling me it wasn't safe. And that wasn't just about being on the balcony. That was also about her concern that they knew where we lived. It was this moment really stays with me. My witnessing of the othering of groups led to my interest in the work of philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, for example, which I've explored in my PhD research. At this period, there was also the early development of Canary Wharf, which is London's second business district. And since then, the area has undergone continuous development, making Tower Hamlets one of the richest yet poorest parts of Britain. And to me, the developments offer a visual marker of inequality, which contributes to my reflections around difference and otherness. I'm also drawn to what I consider as my kind of formative music experiences in my childhood. Experiences such as taking up invitations to participate in various music projects. I remember that I'd just began learning the baritone, and I was shortly after playing a version of Mars from Host Planets in a really brightly lit red Royal Festival Hall, and I remember the colour being on me and shining off of the baritone. I also remember miming most of the music because I'd only just started learning the baritone. Um, I remember being awarded a scholarship to attend the Centre for Young Musicians, a Saturday music school at Morley College, London, and being loaned a tuba for 7 years. And I also reflect on my study at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, where I undertook the leadership programme to explore participatory practice through music making. I often felt, and I was quite literally, at home in this context, since many of the course projects took place in my home borough of Tower Hamlets. It was from these experiences that my curiosity around the role of musicians in music making with communities developed, including questions such as, was I a leader or facilitator, and did it matter? My concern around practice terminology and labels was further informed by my work as an administrator, music leader, and supporting musician for various participatory projects and organisations. Through focus on music making with the marginalised or disadvantaged in the community, alongside articulations of practice that included outreach, giving back, or access, I wondered how were groups being identified as marginalised and disadvantaged in these music making contexts? Why were institutions and organisations reaching out? Why did they have to reach? Was there an implied distance? And what was being given back and why? And where was I in this? And I offered just these two facets of my positionality for the purpose of keeping this presentation contained. This is just some of what informs what I share today. And I now want to think about positionality in practice. So, I should say that the images from practice are taken from both my professional practice and my PhD practice. Positionality in practice might be thought about with regards to the community musician's physical position in the room in relation to the groups and individuals they make music with. Why, for example, lead from the front or lead from within? Why lead alongside or outside the space? And what does this mean for practice? Here I'm also thinking about position in relation to the socio-political context. I recognise, for example, that I'm not the same as the people I make music with, or to use Levinas's terms, other than, I'm not the same. And although, often we come from the same geographic area and we may have some similar lived experiences. And although I work towards ways in which we can make together, I'm trying to work towards co-creation where the contributions of those in the group are recognised and valued, my position is different. I recognise that as a facilitator, I'm in a position of power. Now, here I want to note that although my discussion around positionality concerns situatedness, feminist critiques have highlighted that situated knowledge and standpoint epistemologies place too much emphasis on the situatedness of the individual knower to the detriment of understanding knowledge as constituted in relation. And I think this is really important for positionality and thinking about that specifically with regards to community music practice. For example, I don't consider my positionality as a tower of building blocks where my experiences stack neatly one on top of the other to inform the position from which I experience. But instead, that positionality is always emergent and constituted in relation to others. So in this sense, my experiences are entangled, and sometimes some experiences might come to the fore and sometimes some go to the back. I also may view my previous experiences differently as I develop perspectives through and from different experience. And this brings me to critical reflection. So it was not until PhD research that I really began to dig into my position through critical reflection. And this image shows the critical incident section of my online portfolio of practice for the PhD submission. Just going to take some water. There were several significant moments during my PhD practice which I identified as critical incidents. Mujahid's rhyming rap is one of them. So Mujahid, that's a pseudonym, was a child taking part in Cable Street Songwriters, an inter-school songwriting project for 3 primary schools in East London, with 60 children participating aged between 8 to 11 years old for about a year and a half. Mujahid was invited to contribute lyrics, some ideas for a joint school song. In response to this invitation, he approached me with this small post-it note, and it had a rhyming rap that he had written outside of the session time. Now, this gesture was significant because at the start of the project, Mujahid expressed reluctance to participate, and I talk about this in the ethics section of my work. However, a few months into the project, Mujahid was taking part beyond our sessions, and this participation presented a tension. So whilst Mujahid had responded to the creative framework brief in so much as he had written some lyrics and included the optional device of rhyme, the lyric content did not fit the song theme that I had set for the 3 different schools and had hoped that we could use to pull together their different contributions into one piece. And I see Liz smiling there. I wonder if that's been a similar experience. But thinking about Mujahid's contribution, it also presented I was reflecting in action, and it presented some additional contextual challenges, which I discuss in the PhD. At the time, my gut, my sense was not to include this, and I unpack my decision-making process and my working, subsequent working with Mujahid later on in the PhD. But for now, I'm just raising that as a tension. I'm just going to welcome Laura into the room. I'm just raising that as a tension for me, that considering that not all ideas or contributions can or will necessarily be included in a co-creative or collaborative music making moment, it might seem reasonable enough for me to have said to Mujahid, set this aside, do it as a solo for your own track, let's not include it in the joint song. But I really sensed in this instance that Mujahid had felt that he'd been denied an opportunity without receiving a full explanation. And that was really kind of compounded by the fact that I had to leave the school within 5 minutes of this interaction to go to my next workshop session. I'm going to come back to the issue that this moment highlights. I'm going to move on here. Another example of a critical incident was through my interaction with this band, the Radical Luddites. This is a group that came about through my PhD work with Tanghal Smart in York. And working with the Radical Luddites was my realization that across my professional and practitioner researcher practice, this band was the most demonstrably participant-initiated band that I have worked with. And for me, that really kind of took me back. A lot of my work is about, I want it to be what you want to do. How can we do this together? But this band really highlighted to me that actually, every project I do is almost, set up by me or an organization with existing parameters. And this is the first group that I felt really took the driving seat. And there were several critical moments that led to this awareness. That includes Bob. You can see Bob playing the really snazzy electric guitar there without the body. And there was a moment that I talk about where he came and put his hand on my shoulder and asked me to sing a song with him, and that led to this gig. And then there was a moment where the group were involved in the setup and the pack down of a few gigs. They were gathering momentum, and there were numerous interactions that had led to these significant incidents. And what they highlight, alongside the others that I present in the PhD, to me is the complexity of hospitality in practice. So I'm thinking about Mujahid here. I'm thinking about the challenge that actually most of my work isn't really participant instigated. And the challenges kind of include confusion around notions of equality, equality of opportunity, and quality in practice, and the potential for community musicians to enact a disempowering practice as they operate within the conflicting fields of institutional goals, defined roles, personal desires, and interpersonal relationships. These critical incidents also really made me aware of my own personal kind of limitations, the limitations of my own reflective practice prior to this learning. When previously, as a professional practitioner, I thought, yeah, I'm highly reflective. I practice self-reflection. It wasn't until I'd really come to these moments that I realised that there was some criticality lacking. And so that led me, this is the final slide today, that led me to suggest community music as a critical practice through my PhD. This is a paragraph taken from the exegesis where I'm working through critiques raised in the field of critical pedagogy that explain that liberating pedagogies can strengthen the power structures they seek to redress. I was quite concerned for a time that I was strengthening power structures I sought to address through my interactions with Mujahid, for example. I suggest that practicing from a critical position is important for a field that seeks to effect change. For an ethical practice, I agree with Bartley and Higgins that there needs to be deep understanding of what change community music facilitators are trying to make, and the underlying aims, assumptions, and processes behind it. Criticality is required to ensure that concern isn't just directed at doing things right, as in the manner of Schoen's technical rationality, but towards doing the right thing. And I should say the citations are being posted into the chat, so I'll make them available as links in the recording of this event also. I suggest that surfacing this is necessary in order to unpack the work. A critical practice is also important to avoid a stagnant practice. As community music pedagogic processes become increasingly established, they can become taken for granted. Furthermore, under the guise of innovation, as compared to more traditional education practices, for example, they may be churned out repeatedly, regardless of different and changing contexts. My articulation of community music as a critical practice is a response to this period in the field's history. It's my sense that currently there are growing numbers of groups and individuals that seek inclusive music practices, some of which are looking towards authorities for ideas. And there are also those that challenge notions of outside authority and emphasize situatedness. A critical practice speaks to both. It is enriched through exploration of practice and theory, not as an end point or solution, but as a starting point for critical engagement. And I've got some references there. I can share this PowerPoint after today's session.
Thank you, Jo. That was really great. Really, thank you for sharing that with us all today. Unbelievably interesting. I guess now we'll just, if Ryan will be assigning sort of some breakout rooms, we can have 20 minutes, but we can always come back in if we feel that's appropriate, and then we'll have some questions for Jo.
So in terms of just any kind of initial thoughts or responses on Jo's really thought-provoking and excellent presentation, anything that kind of jumps out as initial thoughts?
Yeah, I just think on the whole idea of positionality, just the idea that you can bring your whole self to the research is such a hugely important thing, that you have your even childhood memories and everything that forms you as a person informs you as a researcher as well. And I think that's just such a hugely important point, and to be honest about that and to show those parts of yourself in your research as well and be able to discuss them openly is a great step forward, I think, in terms of practice-based research or arts practice research. Huge step forward.
Yeah, definitely. And, we had a conversation with our master's students this morning, actually, about the way that methodologies have developed and changed, and the way that theoretical frameworks have developed and changed over the years, and the things that we can now do as arts-based researchers that, you know, maybe even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to do in the same way. And I was particularly thinking about Kathleen Turner's beautiful presentation for the Munich Winter School, but also the presentation she did for our student research symposium this time last year, where, you know, to be able to sing your research, to be able to turn your research into song, I mean, that's something I'd never come across before until meeting Kathleen.
But yeah, thinking about being able to acknowledge like where I'm coming from in relation to the research, and being aware, there was the thing she said about being aware that we are, of what's the difference between us and the people that we're working with, and being able to like acknowledge that, rather than just like, I've had times in the past when I've been writing in a paper and I've been criticized for using first person at one point, and I'll be like, okay, so the researcher has a prior connection to this field, and it just feels a bit weird having to like not being able to just say, you know, I've got a connection with this field, or, you know, whatever, and being able to acknowledge my position.
Happens to the parameters of space and place when you move everything onto the internet. And it then isn't just the leader, facilitator, associated musician, whatever term we want to give ourselves for the job that we do, that has positionality in that space. The technology that facilitates the place that you meet and the space that is created, that also has positionality. And I've been struggling with that a little bit in terms of dealing with my students, excuse me, it seems ridiculous to say that Zoom has positionality, but it does have power because it's from the people who coded it, and their positionality comes in their coding. So when we think about things like, especially this week, when we think about DeepMind, the machine that was built to play Go, and how they're using that now to predict the shapes of proteins in DNA, that computer has quite detailed positionality because of the people that have sat there and programmed it. So when we think, oh, well, we're on Zoom and we'll use a Jamboard for something, and then we'll use some kind of digital sound making, every time we draw one of those things in, there's so much more positionality in there, and then they kind of clash against each other. And I don't know if you guys have done this, when you recommend a piece of software to somebody and then you realize that potentially it's not, I recommended something and then I found out about it as a brand and realized that it wasn't socially aware of itself and its importance. So this kind of like agile pivot online has started to make me think in that kind of sense too. I'm going to shut up now. Sorry, that's a lot.
No, but do you know what it's... Sorry, Frances. No, you go. I was just going to say it's really important thinking about the shift in positionality now. So much of what we do is online.
Yeah, and thinking, you know, I've been thinking a lot about Zoom as a space, because how we feel about Zoom kind of, you know, everyone who's joining in uses Zoom for different things. So whether, you know, you've got someone who mostly uses it to chat to their family, they're going to have a different relationship with it than someone who uses it for school and things like that. And so how people feel coming into Zoom as a space is impacted by that more so, I think, than like physical spaces.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right.
Fran, I was wondering about for you with, you know, having finished your PhD and thinking about some of the practice that you were involved with for your PhD, and then moving into kind of postdoctoral researching. Have you felt a shift in positionality? Have you felt like there's been a change for you?
I think it's more of how you identify yourself as well. Because I would definitely, after doing my PhD in community music as an arts practice researcher and a practice-based study, I would never come from any other position ever again, because it's so honest and transparent, and you're reflecting on your own practice, and you're showing people the challenges of it, and you're showing people how you can represent the information in different ways and how it can become accessible to people, because you're telling the story of your research and of yourself in an accessible way. I think that's hugely important to continue with that always.
Now, can I ask you something? As an evaluator who gets hired in that, is there sometimes a misunderstanding from those that hire you that you're going to be objective? And
I'm very careful to point out, even in interviews for roles that are going through a open selection process, that I am not. I don't do the kind of external evaluator, Ofsted inspector kind of role where I'm suggesting that I'm looking onto the project from an outside point of view. And I do say to people, because I think in the arts, to do that, it's a fallacy that you can have this neutral, objective position as an evaluator in the arts, because everyone who does it has a passion for the arts. You wouldn't do it otherwise, because it's not a great money spinner. So I think that. So I think people do. And to be honest, I've been doing this, specialising in evaluation for quite a few years now. So I've now got to the point that a lot of the work I do, I'm just approached by people I've worked with before who know how I work and want me to work with them again, or personal recommendations. And when I do get approached by organisations, and it's clear to me they see the role of evaluator is making them look good to their funder and putting some sort of authoritative stamp of quality on their project, I can back away slowly and say, I'm sorry, I'm too busy to take on new projects at this moment, in a very tactful way. But I do question, when I do that, I do question whether that's the right thing to do, in terms of, my whole motivation for doing this kind of work is to help people and to sort of perhaps bring them along and help them improve their practice and think about evaluation in a different way. So by just moving on from those kinds of people, I'm not actually doing that. I'm sort of, allowing them to get. So I do question whether that is the right thing to do. But at the end of the day, I do get, when you do have clients where you really value their work and your approach to, and I guess, again, this all relates to positionality, when you have a shared way of looking at the world, that makes it a much more enjoyable experience of working together. So I suppose there are difficulties. There's a lot of ethical, what do you say yes to and what do you say no to? There's a lot of ethical choices to be made in that, isn't there? Yeah.
And it's interesting that you said you've sketched a few things for the conference, which would have been a few weeks back. Yeah. But actually, you've got loads to say about it, because it sounds, in a way, I was thinking to myself, it sounds you're having to deal with that all the time in a sense as an evaluator. Especially, as I said, especially when people think for some reason you're just sort of objective, without really realizing that you bring what I call baggage. You bring those lenses that you're looking through, you bring those with you. You can look through different theoretical lenses, you can change them up a bit, but you'll still come into anything with your own experiences and biases, I mean?
Absolutely. And now I think about it, and now you sort of prompted me to think more about it. I think actually that kind of thinking, I do it all the time without perhaps recognizing it, in terms of situations where, like you said, Nicola, there's sometimes you find yourself you're not ethically comfortable with, and you have to sort of think about, well, what do I do? Most of the time everything goes swimmingly and you have excellent relationships with the people you work with, but actually almost all the work I do, I'm being paid by the organisation that is delivering the work. So my relationship and my ongoing professional relationship with them is crucial to, how far can I push them? I don't want to annoy them. I don't want to be too critical of them in that they don't want to work with me again. However, I feel very strongly there has to be an integrity and an honesty in the evaluation, and and it is a critical process. So sort of making that kind of judgments of how far you can push people is something that I think I do that all the time.
Yeah. Emily, do you want to talk about how this relates to your research at all at the moment?
My research is I'm kind of developing it as I go. And at the moment, I'm kind of thinking a lot about the fact that I'm, for want of a better term, a classically trained violinist, and so I'm encountering a lot of tensions, and it's something I'm having to do. I'm having to critique it all the time, and my motivations, as Joe was saying as well, and yet having to interrogate that a lot, and coming into contact with tensions between, for example, the kind of the values of excellence that we kind of get drummed into us from mainstream education, and from kind of, generally speaking, the classical music way of teaching, coming into tensions with that, and then the idea of excellence within community music, which kind of incorporates ideas of inclusion, and more focusing on the process and not the product. Basically, having tensions between my past and how I've grown up as a musician, and been taught, and the inevitability, really, of how that's it finds its way into my way of facilitating things, but that I shouldn't necessarily just try and neglect that because I can't change it. So, yeah.
So Emily, I'm interested in the so you talked about this this idea of product versus process, which I think is, especially because as a trained classical singer, I feel much the same. And when I'm conducting my women's choir, for example, in a traditional choral space, whatever traditional means, to me it means, that part singing and that sort of traditional what a choir looks like, which is something else I'm trying to interrogate in my own research as well, in that a choir doesn't have to be soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and reading from music and it being classical stuff. So yeah, I think that this notion of, and I wonder, I guess, how you all of you feel about community music practice in general, and this idea of product versus process, and where perhaps the tensions lie between those things in community music in general.
Product versus process. There's again in ethnomusicology, Thomas Torino, music is social life, and he talks about these different fields. There's participatory practice and there's presentational practice, and then there's tensions specifically for the community musician, because community musicians straddle the space, and Dave Camlin, now I can't remember the name of the article, but it was in 2014. He explores this a little bit more, almost arguing that a community musician needs to understand presentational, which is product orientated, because so often in a community music space, people find that they end up having to perform what they are doing, and then the community musician needs to guide them somehow, but also maintain the principles and ideals of participatory music making, which is about the process and everybody being together and making music, irregardless of what it sounds like. So it's an interesting concept, especially for classically trained musicians like you, like Emily, like me, I think, like most of us, because it helps, I think, reconcile those identities and those stances that we may find ourselves taking.
I love the way you're opening this discussion into sort of challenging also the polarities between presentation, but what's happening in the critical reflexivity in the space between, how that's negotiated as we go through as a process. It's really exciting. So I really wish you well with your unfolding projects. It's great to reflect in this way. Yeah.
It is.
You know, when we're talking about reflective practice and perceiving that we ourselves are reflective, and then realizing, you know, there's some other thing that happens, or that happened for Joe, or that happens for us, and what that other thing is. So what is it that we are not enabling of ourselves or of our other emerging colleagues as community, you know, as people newer to the field? What is it then that shifts or enables those shifts? You know, if we think about, for the last, I don't know, in the UK, the last, I don't know how long, a long time, reflective practice has been part of the vocabulary, part of a sense of how we work, part of a working culture, an expectation to do that, maybe not everywhere, but certainly in the communities I've kind of worked in. And I know there's moments where I've gone, oh, you know, and had those moments where I've gone, oh, it's not enough to just say that. We need to do something physically in the room, or we need to do X, Y, Z, or whatever the thing is. And, or the criticality of engaging with other ideas and concepts and thinking and debates that we are privileged to access ourselves here, many others aren't. And is that part of it? I wonder what it is, what they are, what those unlocking levers are, or points of, I don't know.
There seems to be an
interesting
parallel kind of in teacher education. We talk about teachers, they've done some theorizing around how as teachers in general, but for us as music teachers, like when they start out, they're so focused on like their own practice and like what skills they're bringing and like, am I saying the right thing? And then things start to open where you're like seeing it, but you can't do anything about it in the moment. And then the third stage is where you really get to reflective practice. I wonder if there's like similar things there where you get to a point in experience and comfortability in the space and with your own work that you start to be able to turn that lens on yourself. I talk a lot about it with my pre-service undergraduates because it's such a big part of them. I see them all in their head, and then they start to see this and they come out and they say, I saw it, but I couldn't, you know, the kid was rolling, I couldn't do anything, but I noticed. So like noticing is the first thing. And then it's like in the moment they can address it. But it's interesting to think about that model as it applies to reflexivity for practitioners. Yeah, it's interesting.
That's nice. That's nice. Being able to, it makes you think of the competence model, you know, the unconscious I can't remember the whole, but that, yes.
I automatically want to do this. It's the matrix thing, isn't it? Yeah. But the teacher education thing's interesting though, because of course in schools, there's like, you might have a framework or like a curriculum or an organizational structure, which there are like codes and competencies that you need to know to be able to do it. However, then what happens in regards to your creative practice in the musical spaces in the school is, you know, that's all the unknowns and the where the rolling or whatever it was you said, but you can see what the kids are doing, and it's how you get to thinking about your reflexivity in those spaces. And you think about thinking about community musicians in the UK, where those frameworks or structures are, to my mind, feel much less stable. Some of them are formalized, but they're less stable, and there's so much precarity, it's hard to say, around the working conditions that it's almost, I think that's what I was saying about like reflective practice or reflexive practice perhaps, and thinking about what kind of questions you're asking and why, get so soaked up into this kind of cycle of needing to do the work in a particular way to satisfy like the structures and things that Joe was talking to. And I think that's where I think that music aids in that more school-based pedagogical sense, and thinking about community musicians and their pedagogies and the structures. I think there's something like Bex, what you were saying about where's the offshoot points. I think there's something at that intersection that it's not just that community music is an offshoot of music education, but actually it's like embroiled as like complementary practices or something. I think we're getting kicked out. Sorry, I went on a roll. Right, I'm going to stop recording this, but it was lovely to speak to you all.
Just want to follow up. We talk a lot about that. What does music ed have to learn from community music? Because that flexibility and reflexivity is such a strength. And as we talk more and more about culture responsive practice in our classroom, community, that's why I teach the seminar, right? It's because we have so much to learn from this kind of practice and the way, you know, it's responsive to the needs of the client, or the people coming into the space, and the hospitality thing. So there's so much of that aesthetic that we want to draw into music education, I think would be beneficial for us. And so it's super, like, that's like the magic spot right there for us. It was nice to chat with you all. Thank you so much.
Welcome back, everyone. Hope you're doing all okay. Yeah, it's getting dark out there. I guess we've got a bit of time now. We've got a good 10-15 minutes or so to either kind of, I could answer any questions if you have any in response to the presentation, or comments, or if there's anything you want to share that came up in your breakout that was of interest and you think might be worth offering out to the group. And if you want to do that, we're a really small group today, so feel free to just unmute and speak away.
I've got, oh, sorry, go on.
No,
yeah, Zoom snap.
I'll try and be really brief then. I've got a question about the thing you did with the radical Luddites, which was, you talked about how you related to them and how it was different, but how did that interaction come about, and how did you interpret what your role was in it?
So are you talking logistically, like practically?
Yeah, I mean, was it how did you encounter? Were they an existing group, or did you help put the group together?
No, this is a great question. And actually, I should probably, I don't know if I've already done it, share the link to my portfolio of practice, because it gives the contextual information for each group. So I was very fortunate to have a PhD studentship for study. So I was awarded some money to do the research based at York St John University. And I write about this, about not wanting to kind of continue all my practice in London and use that York money in London, which is relatively better financed for the arts compared to the north of England. So I took a year, the first year of my PhD, to forge relationships and meet different music making groups in the area close to York and also North Yorkshire. And Tangle Smart was one of the groups that I'd volunteered with. I did quite a lot of volunteering with different groups to see if it would be the right fit. I started working with Tangle Smart on a couple of their existing programs. So Musication is one of them, which is a program for adults with experience of mental ill health or homelessness, or adults that are in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction, or a combination of any of those factors, to just have a place to make some music, write their own songs. There's a big record label output. And I also worked alongside their music making group for a piece called Sound Smart for adults with learning disabilities. I'm using their terminology. And Bob actually was a member of Musication, and I'd been working with him and with the others in the group on a one-to-one basis as part of this PhD interaction and their songwriting. And one day I walked into the group and they'd all got together and started playing some bossa nova. And I was like, oh, this is lovely. I'll make a cup of coffee and enjoy that. And that's when Bob said, no, Jo, we want you to sing and we want you to kind of support the band. So at that moment I had to make a call, and I felt that I could support within my time allocation to the PhD the kind of development of a discrete project, which they called a Community Music Tuesday morning initially, but it developed into this band. And later on there's some complications with that, because the band created a certain status where people felt that they couldn't enter, and that wasn't quite perhaps what the centre wanted to be offering, so they had to rejig it. And I talk all about that in, I'll find the link now while I wait for another question. Okay.
Joe, I've got a question if there's time, if there's space.
Nicola, I love that I know your voice now. I wasn't looking at the screen. I'm like, yes, people unmute.
I'm not sure that's a good thing.
No, I love it. It's good. Yeah, go for it.
We touched on this in our breakout group. So it's really interesting. The whole topic is fascinating. So you clearly, shared in your presentation that you acknowledge that you are different to, the people you're working with, the people you're making music with, and sometimes working towards co-creation with. And what do you do, as a community musician, after having that acknowledgement and that level of awareness that you've got, that you are coming from a different place? What do you do with it? What do you do with that knowledge? And how does it guide you forwards? You mentioned the power that you're in a position of power because you're facilitating. You're in a position of power because perhaps your experiences are different for whatever reason, whatever the difference is. It's a different position. And how does that knowledge and awareness guide you going forward? I guess through the music making, and through the common things of community music that we cover, like inclusivity and I don't know, I'm waffling now, but what do you do with it?
It's great. It's a really great question. I mean, the first thing is to acknowledge that everyone is different to everyone. So, you're only an I in the context of the other. You only know that you're a self. I think about my toddler looking in the mirror and she knows that she's not me because she sees my reflection reflecting back at her. And I think about, siblings. I'm one of 5, and how we're all so different because it doesn't matter, even if you're from the same geographic space, potentially with the same parents, with the same potentially upbringing and some opportunities, you've got such a different life experience because you've come in a different order and you're in a different way. So first thing is to recognize we're all different. And I'm thinking about post-structuralism here and the difference in communication and meaning making and how we stretch or how we can ever come to know the other. In practice, listening is really the thing. So I'm trying to practice at being a better listener in the music making and in the conversations and in the project instigation. So alongside better listening is kind of that helps me to maybe ask some critical questions of the work. So quite practically, recently I was sent an advertisement to apply for a gig to lead some singing with a group in a location, and I decided that wasn't going to be for me because now I've got a greater awareness. I've untangled and unmeshed the different kinds of participatory practices that are out there. They're not knotted in this ball of outreach and inclusive music education and community music. I know the distinct strands and I know what I'd like to do. Obviously that has financial implications. And I guess finally it's returning to home. So many of you know that I'm just finishing my self-isolating. I can walk out of the house very soon. But I've returned, back into the schools that most of my formative experience was, where I first established Cable Street Songwriters. And I've realised actually, for me, working through schools supports a longevity of practice. So I'm thinking about like Sue Braden's work and all these kinds of artists that write about needing to be in a space for a longer period to make deep-rooted connections. And right now, I think I'm at a surface level again. It's going to take me a few more years to get to a connected space where I might begin to be more of a community musician with those groups and individuals.
Awesome. That sort of plays into the question I was going to ask originally, Joe, if there's enough time. And it's something that came up again in our breakout room, that we're both, when we're reflecting on our own practice, and I'll talk about myself personally, that some of what I might just call community music work that I do, when I start to reflect on it a bit more, there are some things which are very sort of, it is music education. So for example, I designed an access to jazz course for secondary school age students in Leeds to give them the skills to join the citywide orchestras, that sort of thing. And then some of it, it's music sort of a foil within the space to a social space, perhaps with the work I do with young minds. I wonder if that's something like how that reflective process happens as you're walking between these different spaces. So a school, for example, is very different to Town Hall Smart, and what you carry along with you that stays as a community musician in those different spaces.
Can you ask it a little bit more as a question?
Okay, so when you're thinking of ourselves as critical reflective practitioners, what is it about you as a community musician that may be a thing? It may be a knotted ball of lots of things, but ourselves as our practice as a community musician, what do you think are the things that come with that when you're walking between somewhere like a school or Town Halls and adults projects in Town Hall Smart? What are the things that remain the same? Because everything changes, obviously, but what do you think are the things that remain the same? I think is what I'm getting at.
This is a really good question. I think, no, genuinely, I think actually what you're pointing to, for me, I'm thinking about like intentions for practice. I think I would have said, like maybe a few years ago, that my motivations and intentions for practice would remain the same. But I think now what I've learned, and this picks up on Nicola's point, that my motivations and intentions will be different, and I need to delineate them really clearly with regards to the task that's being set or the agreement that's been made from the start. I guess what I do take with me is my approaches to practice. I like mess, I like noise, I quite like a bit of chaos. I think I feel at home with that. So I do practice in those ways in both spaces. And I don't think I think, oh, this is a school, I'm now in the realm of music education, and this is Town Hall Smart, I'm now in the realm of community music. I don't see it like that. If anything, I think I work more as a community musician in the schools and more as a music educator in Town Hall Smart, as the adults ask me specifically for tuition on particular instruments in particular ways. Bob, for example, really wanted to learn notation and the keyboard, and so, you know, he was using me as somebody that has got a classical training to do that kind of work, which is not the way I enjoy working or prefer working, but of course that was a way he wanted to work, and we did it. Yeah, I think we could have a further conversation about this, though. Might unpack something.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. That was like definitely useful there. Thank you.
Joe, I so enjoyed your presentation, and my head is buzzing with 100 questions. So, but I was just curious. So thank you. I'm just curious, just this critical moment of sharing your work with us in this community. I'm just curious what sense you make of your work as you do this, as it floats out now in the.
Well, I must say I've just had a knock at the door for a delivery, which I might have to go and get. So I wonder if we want to talk about Transform, and I will come straight back to that question.
Okay, we'll have a quick chat about Transform under these circumstances. I don't know if the link is in the chat, is it? The link for the new journal? Possibly not yet, but we'll get it in there before the end. So the new issue of Transform, can you all hear me? Yeah, is out today. And Transform is the open access journal, online peer-reviewed journal for emerging scholars working in the field of community music. And it flows from the annual student symposium for community music researchers in York, St. John. And I've had the privilege of going there for the last number of years. And it's really, really fantastic to hear all the work from community musicians all over the world. But it's great to see the research now being captured in this journal, and giving the idea is to give early career researchers an opportunity to experience the publication process. And I have now seen it from both sides because I had an article in the first journal in 2018, and I thank you, Lee, for giving me the opportunity of being editor this year. And it's been really, really eye-opening, because to see the process from both sides is really, really interesting. But the whole idea is that authors are mentored and encouraged, and they have a little bit more engagement in terms of the peer review they get, that the language is encouraging, and that people can take the encouraging aspect of that on board and work towards being helped and mentored, as opposed to feeling maybe vulnerable about trying to write something, because we all know that that can be very, very daunting, because we know it's going to be there forever in print. So the whole idea is working through a mentorship process and an encouraging process, and having much more liaison with everybody in the process, and it's a partnership publication. So I use the word collaborative, really. I think that's probably the best way to describe it. And I really enjoyed working with the authors this year. There are 4 authors. 2 of them here. Ryan is there, I think. Yeah, and Catherine. And Kathleen Turner, who did an amazing, beautiful, emotive presentation last year at ICCM, and she captured her presentation in the first article in the journal. And the second article is by Catherine, and she talks about the York St. John Prison Partnership Project, singing and songwriting project. And then we have Ryan, who talks about the language in the in the sounding board journals. I caught on the hop here, sorry. About empowerment, ownership and transformation, the terms that we have come to use more frequently as community musicians. And he looks into the language of that in the sounding board journals, and how that has come to be in terms of maybe policy influence, and how the language changed over the years in the journals and things like that. And then in our final article, Chi-Ying Lam, also known as Gigi, she writes a very topical article about 2 community music practitioners in Hong Kong trying to cope with teaching and learning online, and their experiences of doing that and the challenges that they faced within that process. I really would like to encourage people to take up this opportunity. I found it a wonderful opportunity to write an article in from my 2017, I think it was, presentation at ICCM, and just to be able to put that on paper and see it there in an article is just a huge sense of achievement attached to that. And I think for the authors this year as well, it was just interesting to see the articles just building to a point where they were just such an interesting read, and really get you inside the process and the practice of community music, which is really, really important in research now, to see that person, to see authors sharing their practice, sharing their experiences, and it's in writing, forever in a wonderfully mentored and encouraging way, which I think is really the most important point. Have we the link there? Oh, we do. Does everybody see that, the flyer?
Yeah, it should be there in the chat there, and the link to the journal.
So the journal's there and the link to it, and you can read issue 2 there. And thank you, Lee, for the opportunity for this year. I really, really have enjoyed the process, and I've really enjoyed working with the authors. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Fran. I mean, you've done a fantastic job, and I know, speaking to all the authors involved, that the care that you've given with the process has been amazingly appreciated, and as a kind of learning education, a learning journal, which is the idea. It's been great. It's been great that you've been doing that. Really appreciate that. Everyone has. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Back to Joe.
Thank you. Sorry. So I thought, sorry, I paused because I didn't know if Catherine and Ryan wanted to introduce the student symposium, but actually maybe I should return to Liz's question. So just trying to remember that, sorry. Thinking about my work going out, Liz, is that right? Am I getting that right? And how I'm feeling about that, or?
I'll just keep it here and now, in the moment, just how it is now.
Well, I think actually it's interesting because I've done quite a few presentations, and it does feel quite different it being recorded. I was thinking about vulnerability with regards to how much you share in terms of positionality, and for me, positionality is a very personal thing, and I might share
more if it's in a moment of a time, of a space, which makes me think about community music practice and it being relational and in that moment with others. And actually the way documenting something changes it, although Fran, I agree, and writing things is helpful, and I will take that note. Yeah, I guess one thing I'm always thinking about how to connect with practitioners and impact on practice, and I'm aware that like increasingly my presentations are kind of moving it with language that might not be as in the same realm of discussion or in a different way. And this, interestingly, this has been the first ever presentation I've given without playing any sound, any music. From the people I make music with, I just felt there wasn't really enough time to do that through the Zoom call, but it is, and because I've got my portfolio that you can go to and have a listen on there, so that was interesting. I'm not sure. I feel like there's things, it's going to go somewhere, I'm hoping, but I guess I've found it personally quite difficult to take stock coming out of a PhD in the context of a pandemic with a toddler. So that's where I'm at, I think. But thank you, Liz. I feel that encouragement through the screen, and I will take that forward with me. We've got like, yeah, just some of this. So we've got about 10 minutes left on this call. Catherine and Ryan might have had to go for teaching. We're going to talk about the Student Symposium, but I guess we could squeeze one more question in if there were one, or you're very welcome to email me. Oh, Kerry.
I have one. You won't want me to email you. I'll be sending you voice notes on WhatsApp for about a fortnight after this. Every time I see some of your work presented, I have an existential crisis, but it's always a good one. So I like have a crisis and then I have to think. So the existential crisis that I came up against in our breakout room was, and I don't know how you feel about this because we share part of our role. I try very, 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 very hard to not see myself in any of my students, regardless of whether they're composition students or community musicians. And I try not to think about it as teaching community music. I try to see it as manufacturing situations for learning. Now, after another conversation that I had with you about this, but then I realized, and I don't know what you think about this, and you're going to be like, oh, this is a head hurter. By trying to mitigate our own positionality with our leadership students, are we actually doing more negative? Are we having a more negative impact in that space with them than we would be if we weren't so worried about seeing ourselves reflected in them? Does that make sense? So by trying really hard to remove ourselves and get out of the procedures and out of the process, especially out of like the music making that they do or their approaches to their practice, so it's all theirs, and trying to make sure that nothing bears any resemblance to ours, do you think that we're doing a disservice? And by worrying about that positionality being present, we're actually not helping. I haven't got an answer to this, by the way. I'm just panicking and I want to know what you think.
Mary, I love your open sharing. It's beautiful. I think that to think about your positionality and to be really clear about the power or privilege that might be at play in a relationship and who might have that at any particular time is not to separate yourself from the people you're music making with. So maybe I confused that when I talked about leverness and, I'm not the same as you, there's difference. But I believe that we develop, I'm thinking about women's ways of knowing here, that we develop in relation, and we are who we are in the context of others. So whilst it's very complicated because it's not one or the other, while we're not the same, I can never come to know you in complete fullness because I'm not you.
you contribute to my growth through our conversations. So I'll take away this moment, and that will impact my thinking going forward. And I'll probably reflect on this point and how to make it perhaps clear that positionality is not about, and lots of my diagrams didn't help with that. And I mentioned that feminist critique of, the Noah in isolation, because it's not about separating out to be like, okay, completely different, completely other than, in the sense of that distance that I think you're describing, but it's about just recognizing your role, recognizing where you are in the relationship, that power is always present. And in some contexts that can interchange. In the context of your students, for example, and I'll be political here, when they're paying fees and there might be an expectation of certain outcomes, they can sometimes hold the power. So power can shift between the people and groups and those relations. So I don't think it's simple. And I guess, returning to Liz's comment, the more I've gone through the PH journey, the more kind of complicated and tangled things have become. It's not this or that, it's all kind of both in and one at the same time and meshed. So, but Kerry, thank you for that thought. I'll try and think more clearly about that. Bex has got one. Go on, Bex. Go on.
Oh, is the time?
Go on. We'll squeeze it in, and then I'll try and talk quick.
It's okay. I'll try and speak quick too. So, I've been wondering about. I've looked at. Thank you for sending me the information you sent about your work, and I saw your presentation, and it's been really helpful and useful. So I'm at the beginning of a PhD journey and redesigning it because of the current context. And one of the things I'm doing is looking back at work and looking at and framing this probably as practice research. And I've started to wonder whether, and it connects to, I think, what Kerry was talking about just there, the practice that we evolved, which we aim to be of co-authorship and co-creation, with all of the constraints that we won't ignore in terms of privilege and power in that dynamic. I've started to wonder whether the practice that was developed with a particular group was co-practice. So the practice itself would not have emerged. So as opposed to me only owning that practice and saying, this is my practice is, did it emerge because of those practitioners, those young people as artists, as considering the practice, as young leaders within that space? So very much connects to what you're talking about, I think, in terms of knowing in relation. But I'm not sure whether those ideas have been expressed elsewhere in terms of the practice itself being something that's
I must say,
co-created.
There's lots of emphasis on co, but I personally haven't come across the term co-practice. So I think an exploration of co-practice would be interesting, aside from people that co-lead anyway. So if you're in a team of 4 that regularly are leading a work, you'll think of that as a collaboratively devised practice that you might have some kind of ownership of. But I've not actually heard the articulation of a co-practice with maybe participant groups, for want of a better term. And I think that could be a great exploration. Bex, I'd be happy to talk more. We've got a few minutes left on the call, and I would like to pass over to Catherine, if that's okay, to bring us the joy and the good news.
Yeah, so Ryan apologises. He had to go off to another meeting. But yeah, I did want to say that plans are underway for our ICCM Student Symposium 2021. And we are all kind of stations ahead for meeting in person next November. So let's hope that by this time next year, things look very different to how they are currently at the moment. So we're looking at dates in early November at the moment, the 8th and 9th, but that's a kind of TBC. So just hold that a little bit lightly and we'll confirm those. We do know that our symposium theme, drawing from emerging themes that came up through the symposium last year and actually have been not just present in terms of conference spaces, but also in these discussions, and then culminating in Joe's presentation today, which is that of positionality. So we're really excited about exploring these ideas further and really thinking about these in relation to our research and our practice. So look out for information in going in, like, forward into the new year. And we will be putting out the call at some point, I imagine, in kind of late January, early February, something like that. So yeah, we will really look forward to hopefully welcoming everyone in person to York St John next November.
Awesome, thank you, Catherine. I suppose we're nearing the very end now, aren't we? So I'd just like to thank Joe, obviously, for speaking, but then everyone else as well for coming and participating in the conversation. It's been awesome, awesome last one of term. And just some things going forwards. If you want to put some dates in your diary, these will be shared in the chat, but the next 3 events for next term are coming up. And also, as always, there's a call for participation for the ICCM conversations, and so that we can receive proposals now for that up to January 2021. So if you want to have a look at that, and please follow our social media and the ICCM YouTube channel. If you could subscribe to that, that would be useful to the ICCM. And thank you for having me here today as well, as much as everyone else, and I really enjoyed it.
Brilliant job. Thanks, Rory. Thank you for everyone's help on the call, actually. Very much a team effort, as always, with help from, Ruth, Ryan, Rory, Nicola, Catherine, Sarah Jane, and Hannah and Emily. So many now. I'm having to remember all the names, and Lee, of course. So I think, Lee, I'll hand over to you. This is our last one of this year before we head into a winter break. Lee, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, thanks, Joe, for today, but actually a big thanks for organising the whole series. And I know that you're very, you're very appreciative of the teamwork, and there is a teamwork behind it without a shadow of a doubt. But it really has been your kind of like oomph and your push to put together a really cracking group of 7 events. And when you go onto our YouTube to see the work Nick has done in terms of editing, I want to thank him also in terms of editing the things together and putting up the little trailers. I think it looks brilliant, and we really are building up a body of work. And to think that these came out of when we went into lockdown, just a few of us getting together going, what are we going to do? And so we've put together a few webinars before the summer, and then it's turned into this. And as Rory said, we've got plans to do another 7, and they're being structured at the moment. And Joe will be coordinating that with the team across next semester. So I want to have a big thank you, really, for everyone's been involved in it. But I particularly wanted to just say thanks, Joe, for all your efforts. It's been really a fabulous series, and I think we can see the fruits of that on the YouTube channel, and it would not have happened without COVID. This would not have happened. So just, there has been some things have flowered in ways that wouldn't happen. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. And just to say how interesting that the interest has been so sustained. We're regularly getting between 80 to 90 people book on each call, and then attendance dips on the day because we are in the COVID context and people are having things come up, but we're getting lots of views. So if you can't make an event, go and watch it. If you want to re-watch it again, very welcome to. And there'll be some more shorts coming up to make it a bit more digestible and to signpost there. Thank you, everyone. I think we'll end the call. If you are within the ICCM and you want to stay on, you're very welcome to. Everybody else, hope you have a brilliant holiday season, whatever you're celebrating, in any way you do that. Have a lovely time, and I will see you all soon, I hope. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for joining.